It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Happy to be here.
Happy you could make it. Happy as well to welcome Thomais Papagiannou, Paris correspondent for Greek public broadcaster ERT. I say Paris correspondent, but you also cover Brussels, so you have quite a big remit.
I covered Brussels once when our correspondent there is unavailable.
Okay, all right, okay.
I have to give credit to him.
You give backup. We have a journalist and author, I should say, the French news agency AFP's Adam Plowright. His new book, The French Exception, Emmanuel Macron, The Extraordinary Rise and Risk. More on that perhaps later. How are you?
Look forward to it. Nice to see you, Francois.
And nice to see Douglas Herbert, France 24's very own.
Good evening.
Back from covering UN Week.
It was crazy. Yeah.
It was crazy.
Well, getting through security was crazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
The World This Week. Maybe that story later. On Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. It's anyone's guess what'll happen Sunday in Catalonia. What was separatists intent on staging a banned independence referendum? They claim they've got some 2,000 polling stations ready. We're getting reports from AFP that some are occupying potential polling stations. Equally determined, though, Madrid arresting officials, confiscating ballot boxes, pressuring Google to shut down websites, shutting potential polling stations. Now, key to whether or not the Spanish government succeeds is the Mossos d'Esquadra, the 17,000-strong Catalonian regional police. Now, they've said they're going to uphold the law and obey orders, but it's unclear whether they'll actively prevent citizens from voting or not. Spain, for its part, or Madrid, we should say, deploying reinforcements by the thousands. They somehow, though, I guess they seem less menacing when they're on cruise ships in the harbor of Barcelona. Catalan, and you can see those cruise ships. One of them even has, perhaps we can show it in a moment, on the side of it, Sylvester and Tweety Bird. It seems innocuous enough. Everyone's saying we're not going to have civil war because that's not what Barcelona's about. But nonetheless, Christopher Dickey, it's unclear what's going to happen Sunday.
You're right. It's completely unclear what's going to happen. I think we can say that there's an irony here, which is that if the vote had gone ahead, it's far from clear that the vote would have been in favor of independence. Now there's going to be shall we say, an abridged voting. And the Catalans who have been pushing independence will say, but you see, we would have won if we'd been able to hold a fair vote. And the actions of Madrid are going to give credibility to that argument, emotionally at least, among a lot of Catalans who might have been ambivalent before, but don't want to see Madrid interfering in Catalonia the way it's interfering. And they may be on cruise ships, but to have the police from Madrid, particularly the Guardia Civil, coming in from Spain into Catalonia is very problematic.
And let's not forget, I mean, beyond just sitting out there on the cruise ship, they've already had some pretty heavy-handed measures taken. You know, they've seized ballots. They've tried to get at the boxes, the actual ballot boxes themselves. We've had some high-level, really senior officials in the regional government arrested. So there's been, this real heavy-handed, almost, intimidation tactics, which, as Chris was saying, could really backfire in a sense against Madrid and actually stoke more of a separatist sentiment that wasn't naturally perhaps there to this extent at the very beginning.
Yeah, and as you both say, there's sort of two arguments. One on independence itself, where there's more of a divide than over whether or not to stage the vote.
We have to vote on October 1st so people can say what they want. You can't shut people up by force in a democracy. The right to vote is fundamental.
I don't want to cut ties with my country. It's the result of generations of hard work. We've defended it and built it together, and now the independence movement wants to divide it, to maybe become richer, but by abandoning the other regions.
To maybe become richer. Seems to be money at the sort of around this, because the Catalans saying we pay too many taxes. Who's profiting from this situation? There's sort of lots of arguments going on at once here, Adam Plowright.
That's right. I mean, Barcelona is obviously one of the main economic hubs of Spain. I think that feeling, some of the analysis is that the financial crisis of 2008, which hit Spain particularly hard. And I think Barcelona and the Catalan region has a feeling that in some ways that it's had to bail out the rest of Spain more than other regions. And I think that's fed some of the resentment and the independent feeling in Catalonia.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag world this week. This one, Scots, be proud that you're part of a decent, fair democracy that let you decide your destiny, and you chose wisely in that. Hashtag Catalonian referendum. Your reaction to that, Tomais Papayannou?
Catalonia for Spain is a very tricky region. Catalonia really played an active role during the civil war. That's one reason. It's not a minor region for them historically. There is the Basque terrorism during long years, decades. And then there is the Brexit, and then there was the economic crisis. So all of those reasons now hit the Spanish state at its heart. And they cannot let it go like that. They have to be tough on Catalonia.
But 3 years ago there was another referendum, and that time they eased off more.
Because the circumstances were different. We were in the middle of a huge crisis where everybody was wounded by this crisis, and especially banks from Catalonia had also to be rescued by the state at that time. So that was a pretty easier way to deal with a referendum. It reminds me of the Montreal, the Quebec referenda. During long years, they had several referenda. But let's take it like a micro Europe. It's like the rich states don't want to pay for the poor regions. Now it hits back, and Catalonia doesn't want to pay for the poorer regions also. There are so many dimensions that hit the whole Europe, may I say. That's why everybody's so interested, because there are so many parameters, and it's not an easy task. And I'm sure Madrid won't let it go like that, because it can create an avalanche of reactions, domino reactions everywhere. In Italy, in Greece, even in Greece, because there is such a resentment towards the capital that it may create a big reaction.
Belgium,
thank you.
Christopher Dickey, we heard a minor politician on breakfast radio here in France say, well, the Corsicans should have be able to have a referendum.
Well, I think there are probably a lot of people in France who think that would be a good idea, and including if Corsica decided to wave goodbye. Which brings us to the question of what exactly do the Catalans think they're going to do if they get independence? It's going to be this little statelet of a few million people. It has a big economy within Spain. It's going to have a much bigger economy. If it were part of Europe, which it won't be, it's already clear from Brussels, they're not going to say, oh, yes, welcome Catalonia. So what are the Catalans thinking? It's a way of pressuring Madrid, and I think it's partly a way to pressure Madrid on a specific issue. The Basque country, we know, had a lot of troubles with ETA, with the terrorism over years. As that was being settled, one of the things that happened with the Basque country, as I understand it, is that the Basque government is able to keep its tax revenues in the Basque country. That's not the case in Catalonia. And the Catalans are saying, why them and not us?
Because they have, they have everything. They have their own government, they have their own police force, they have their own parliament.
They have their own language.
Basically, right, their own language. They have their own jurisdiction over education, over health, over security, over social issues. They don't have the fiscal issues. They don't have the tax
So it is about money.
Yeah.
And it's about money, but it's also, as some of you were mentioning, about history. And you find that no more so than on the football field. Vote or no vote, the whistle will blow at 4:15 p.m. local time Sunday at the new Camp. FC Barcelona will be hosting Las Palmas in a Spanish Liga match. The club last week came out publicly in favor of the vote. And while it claims to be neutral on the question of independence, its favorite son is not the current manager of Manchester City. Pep Guardiola has attended pro-independence campaign rallies and fielded questions at team press conferences. I mean, Barcelona's football club is its most marketable item of the whole region. And here you have the club, which is involved in politics, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will, given how deeply, football is in the veins of the Catalans, and I'm sure that will certainly sway some people if seeing Pep Guardiola come out like that. I was going to make a point though about just talking about the economic argument, and I think it's referendums on something like this they're such complicated arguments that need to be made beforehand of discussions, and it certainly can't happen in an environment like we see this week. And if you take, for example, something like the Scotland referendum that we had, one of the arguments of the independent camp in that was, we would be much richer or potentially much richer without. Look at all the oil resources we have in the North Sea that eventually is shared between the UK, and if we kept those for ourselves and the Scottish waters, we would be much wealthy. I mean, a couple of years on, the oil price is much lower, and the Scots would be significantly poorer, would be having, if they had voted for independence, they'd be having huge budget problems, even worse budget problems than they would have had at the time. So, how rich you feel, it can vary depending on the economic circumstances. So,
and the regional arrogance of Catalonia is pretty pronounced. It has suffered a lot. But I remember years ago, maybe 20-some years ago, interviewing Jordi Pujol, who was the engineer of a lot of this, and he was sort of the Danny DeVito of Catalonian politics. And he was constantly talking about the immigrants coming to Catalonia. And I said, so what do you mean? Moroccans, Algeria? No. He meant people from Andalusia. He meant people from the rest of Spain. He was calling them immigrants even then. So this idea of building up Catalan statehood and sort of putting it in the face of other Spaniards has been a pronounced one. And some people will tell you that the reason that there's a very big, in fact, North African population in Catalonia, which, by the way, Jordi Pujol referred to as Los Moros, is that they wanted people who couldn't vote to come and work. They didn't want Spaniards who could vote. They wanted literal immigrants who couldn't.
All right, France 24 will be there Sunday for coverage. We'll be in Barcelona. Now, Catalonia's side, the French president's come up with a mighty long and ambitious laundry list of proposals to empower not Spain or Catalonia, but the entire European Union. Emmanuel Macron's keynote speech at the Sorbonne on Tuesday, covering everything from a Eurozone budget and parliament, a European defense force, to call for transnational plans for fighting forest fires. The 39-year-old Macron making his pitch before students from across the continent in the storied Paris University's main amphitheater.
It is up to us, to you, to define the only path that ensures our future, the one I wish to speak with you about today. It's the rebuilding of a Europe that is sovereign, united and democratic. Together, let us be bold enough to draw this path.
Tamais Papagiannou, what was the mood like in the room? You attended the speech.
Oh, it was interesting. It was interesting indeed. Well, I cannot say that the youth enjoyed it so much because it's kind of boring to hear a speech for 40 minutes. How much did that last?
No, it's more closer to 2 hours.
Oh my God, I thought it was for ages. For me, myself, it was a very, very long speech.
When you sleep through part of it.
Oops. It was interesting. It was so French, very ideological, very aspirational, can we say that? But it's so anti-German, because Germans are so concrete, so realistic, so into the point. The French vision of Europe, it's so, let's say, visionary, if I can...
Yeah, analysts dusted off an old expression, triumphant Gaullism, using the trimmings of a grand hall as the backdrop for making this big speech where you go into, and he set like specific deadlines for doing a lot of the stuff that he wants to do.
Yeah. I think one of the points I make in my book is about Emmanuel Macron. Is that you look at throughout his career, and at each point, he's constantly sort of looking for the next rung up, and he's an incredible. You don't become president of France. He's an incredible climber, and you don't become president of the youngest ever president of France, age 39, without sort of having that constant aspiration to go higher. And I think the next. Logically, the next step for him is sort of, leader and visionary for Europe. And I think he absolutely sees himself in that role. And I think the interesting thing, and you mentioned it is the relationship with Germany and Angela Merkel. Is how does she react to the French president, who suddenly sees himself as the sort of ideas man and the visionary for Europe?
I was just going to play off the idea of, on a personality level, and when we were at the UN, he held a news conference for a handful of journalists of the French delegation, journalists just sitting there in the room, and you could really feel his energy. I mean, he hammers away point by point. He's extremely logical. He's extremely methodical. He is, dynamism, I know, is now the cliched word to use with Macron, but you really do feel that. You come away saying, even if you don't agree with him, you come away sort of saying, I don't agree with that, but I sort of agree with that. He can be very convincing, and he does project that energy. So there's a sense, if there is a vacancy free right now, to assume that sort of intellectual pulpit and the leadership pulpit in Europe as a leader, he might be a prime candidate for that.
That clip we played earlier, Christopher Dickey, it sounded a bit like John F. Kennedy's inaugural speech, the way it's sort of a booming aspiration, calls to boldness.
Boldness. By the way, the word he used was l'audace, right?
Yes.
L'audace, l'audace, toujours l'audace. That's Napoleon. I mean,
An Obamian.
I mean, in fact, what's the word? We're sitting here searching for a word as we're having this conversation for what the role would be that he would assume. And the word that keeps coming to mind is emperor. Is that the role he's looking for? He's clearly looking to do this not by conquest, but through the conquest of ideas, by building up the economy of France, by stabilizing it so it's not a burden, seen as a burden by the Germans, but more as an equal, but by coming forth with these visionary ideas, when in fact you have this sense of Germany kind of in an intellectual mire. Look, when The Economist, as they just did today, The Economist put him on the cover of The Economist, he's in the spotlight, and Angela Merkel is sort of like this in the shadows on the stage. There's an even better cartoon on the inside where there's both lifting a barbell, and he looks powerful, and she's kind of dangling from it. So when The Economist is doing that, conservative as it is, and not terribly pro-French historically, it's pretty striking.
All right, we'll pick up on that point and see if the election results across the Rhine may have curbed some of Macron's enthusiasm. When we come back, you're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey, foreign editor, is present. Welcome back as well to Thomaïs Papayannou, Paris correspondent for Greek public broadcaster ERT, which at one point lost its name and then got it back.
And gained it back.
And got it back, all right. Also with us, Adam Plowright, a journalist for the French news agency AFP. Your new book, hot off the presses, The French Exception, Emmanuel Macron, The Extraordinary Rise and Risk. France 24's Douglas Herbert is with us as well. Thanks for being with us. We were talking just before the break about that cover of The Economist, Macron's address this week, earning him that place on the cover. And if you take a look at it, as Christopher Dickey was saying, Merkel seems. Is she the one? How do you interpret it, Doug?
I don't, she's there in the wings though, but she could be the power, behind the spotlight there. She's not out. You could.
She's either humbled or the power.
I could read that cover either way there. I mean, I just don't know.
Yeah, but you can't read the text of the magazine either way.
No, Europe's New Order. Absolutely.
Well, actually, let's read a little bit of the text. Its lead editorial gives Macron an A for effort, but raises doubts as to whether the other EU members can adopt his reforms. They may not be tried out at all unless Mr. Macron can make a success of his policies at home. For if France remains a threat to the EU's stability rather than a source of its strength, its president can never be more than a bit player next to Germany's chancellor. Adam, on that point, France, the French president had been cautioned by some not to make this speech 2 days after the German general election. He went ahead with it anyway. Was that a smart move?
I think it was. If the decision was based on the idea that after the elections at the weekend, that the German political parties that are expected to form the next coalition, which is Merkel's Conservative Party, and then you have the FDP and ecologists, and that they will then over the next weeks possibly months, sit down and make their coalition contract. And unless Emmanuel Macron made his speech at this point, that all his ideas that he wanted to get across, which he outlined in his speech, that he had to do that now while those discussions were taking place. And if he waited until the government was formed, it was going to be too late. And by that time, sort of all the German policies on Europe would be baked into that coalition agreement.
Yeah, you say weeks or months, it may be Christmas or later before the Germans agree on a new coalition government. Already it's obvious that Merkel's making room for the liberal FDP party, with news that longtime finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble is leaving to take the gavel as Speaker of Parliament. His spot in the cabinet coveted by the FDP. I imagine that in Greece, not too many people are sad to see him go, but will his replacement be any different?
Ambivalence, exactly, because Schäuble had a very bad reputation in Greece, but the successor of Schäuble may be worse than Schäuble, because he already said during the campaign, the leader, that we want Grexit. We want the Grexit. We can forgive their debt, but we want them out of the Eurozone. They can stay in the European Union, but out of the Eurozone. So it's very clear from the beginning that this is the worst possible solution for the Greeks. They're preparing to leave the third memorandum at the end of summer. So they are very hopeful that things will change eventually. But having this new finance minister is the worst case scenario.
I was going to say, because after all the restructuring, can we say that things have moved on? We're in 2017.
They have moved on, but not in the very good and right direction. Things have not changed in the mainstream economy at all. They're more or less the same level. What has changed is the mentality and the good spirit that things may be better in a year from now. This is mostly like the mood has changed, because it was the worst ever, like a year or 2 years ago, to 2015.
So the Greeks and everyone else waiting on who the next finance minister will be. Now, complicating the formation of a new government in Germany, the fact that there's always seems to be an election around the corner. On Thursday, Merkel campaigned for her CDU party ahead of a regional election in Lower Saxony. And while she insists she won't tack right in her fourth term as chancellor, after the strong showing of the far right, which entered parliament for the first time since World War II, there were messages to parts of her base that, well, disagreed her base with her decision to let asylum seekers and migrants in 2 years ago.
We want to send back those who are in breach of the law or don't have a legal residence status. This works out with the secure country of origin, and that's why we need a change on this. That's what a change is good for, ladies and gentlemen.
Is that really any different, though, from what Emmanuel Macron said in his speech at the Sorbonne?
That Europe needs to protect its frontiers, that it needs...
And send back illegal migrants.
No, of course. Look, who would object to sending back illegal migrants? The whole moment for Germany's decision to let in now perhaps 1 million people was the moment of the maximum refugee flow out of Syria. And that was a specific issue. But there are a lot of people who came in who are not from Syria, and who may not have a legitimate claim on the kind of political asylum that the Syrians did. In truth, they may not be as well educated as the Syrians, may not be able to contribute to society as well as a lot of those very middle-class Syrian refugees who were coming in. And, you know, even as they were letting the Syrians in back then, they were kicking out Kosovars who had come in years earlier and had stayed beyond their legal limit. So it's not unusual that if you're going to run an immigration policy on the basis of asylum seeking, when you determine people don't have the right to asylum, you tell them to go home. That hasn't happened in a lot of countries, but I think the demands of European society will be that it does happen.
Did you see when you heard the tone in that clip we played? Is that a dog whistle message, though, to the far right?
Slightly, but I think, I mean, I agree. I think any politician, and we've seen Emmanuel Macron make this argument as well, is that if you're going to ask your population, as Merkel did, as Macron is doing now, to accept asylum seekers, you also have to give them some sort of assurance that your refugee system, your asylum system is working, and part of that system is determining who has a legitimate claim for asylum and who is an economic migrant and therefore has no rights to stay in your territory. So I think the two things, in many ways, the two things do have to come together. If you're going to expect that your population agrees to fund and accept people coming in who are fleeing genuine war, persecution, are coming in. So I think that both of them make that argument, and I think I personally think it's a necessary argument to make.
I think in the current political context, it's the only argument you can possibly make. I mean, for the Germans, we've had debates about this many times on this program. I remember a German journalist saying this is all a moral imperative, but it's always been more complicated than that. It's, first of all, it can't be a blanket opening to everybody in the world to come to Europe. That nobody's going to accept that who's already here, including people who are the descendants of immigrants. But it's also, frankly, I always thought it was a wise move on Merkel's part because it will make her population much younger and more dynamic. One of the great problems of Europe is that it is aging, it is becoming decrepit. France has a fairly high birth rate, but Germany doesn't, most of the rest doesn't either. And if you let in immigrants, especially educated immigrants who can be assimilated into your society, you're going to have a richer, more prosperous, and more dynamic country.
All right, on the issue of how France and Germany get along, this reaction, it's utter nonsense, folks, about Macron. Actions speak louder than words. He's a novice who will need Mutti Merkel, that's her nickname, mother, when things get tough. We opened with Catalonia. Now, speaking of banned independence referendums, what next for Iraqi Kurdistan? Baghdad shutting its airspace to international flights in the wake of Monday's vote. Domestic flights are still allowed, which means passengers will have to transit through the Iraqi capital. The tension mounting. The Kurdish regional government refusing the demand by Baghdad, but also by neighboring Iran and Turkey to hand over control of its border crossings to the Iraqi government. The growing anxiety in stark contrast with the celebrations earlier in the week after a referendum that sparked joy throughout the province and among Kurdish minorities in neighboring states.
The people of Kurdistan have made their decision and entered a new phase. Let nobody blame us for this. Instead of threats and punishments, come and let's have a serious discussion and let's give dialogue a chance.
Let's have a serious discussion, but Masoud Barzani's coming in for criticism for not really having a game plan after the vote.
I mean, he probably was right, hoping to get to the table. At least this would be, a big bargaining chip. He'd be able to, at least force them to talk a little bit more seriously. It's not like he actually thought that KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, would suddenly be this independent statelet. That wasn't going to happen, but at least that bargaining chip power, and it looks like it's just going from bad to worse. Like you said, the airspace, the airport being closed to international flights, Turkey getting jittery with its, security situation on its border and thinking of cracking down itself. So maybe it's too early to say that the move entirely backfired, but it looked like it's beginning to backfire at least. And Barzani is not right now. He's a bit in the hot seat, like you said, and he's not in perhaps a position he had hoped or gambled that he would be in. The referendum vote was last Monday, so we're 4 days out. It's still early days yet, but I would bet that he's not where he hoped he would be on Friday, 4 days after that vote.
And analysts saying inside of Iraqi Kurdistan that we spoke to that they're surprised that the U.S. Hasn't come around, that they're still pressuring Erbil to ease off.
Well, it's surprising in a number of ways. The Kurds of northern Iraq have been very close allies of the United States for a very long time since. In fact, I was there when essentially Kurdistan was created by the Americans in the wake of the Gulf War in 1990-91, because they created no-fly zones. Saddam couldn't get in there, and we've started to have the makings of the Kurdistan we see today. So I think that they feel that there's this close relationship. They've always had a close relationship with Israel, and they feel that they'll get support there, and they have gotten at least verbal support from Israel. But the United States looks at this and says, wait a minute, we're on the verge of defeating the so-called Islamic State, which is breakaway. And the minute we do this, now the Kurds want to break away. They want to be independent. How is that going to work out? We tried desperately to hold Iraq, and for that matter, Syria together as integral states.
Bad timing here.
And then, boom, they go away. But part of this is because the Americans have been so reliant on the Kurds, including in northeastern Syria, in order to fight in Raqqa against ISIS and so on, that the Kurds now have this idea that the Americans will back them no matter what. And that's a mistake. Of course, it didn't help that Donald Trump went on and on and on about sovereignty and national and self-determination in his UN speech.
And he's not the only one, by the way. Turkey's president, who Thursday hosted his Russian counterpart, once again leveled the threat of shutting the oil pipelines that flow out of Iraqi Kurdistan.
The Kurdistan regional government has in fact thrown itself into the middle of the fire with its senseless attempt at independence. I don't accept anyone's independence.
I don't accept anyone's independence, to Mais Papayannou.
All neighbors were against it, but Turkey is so clever. They saw it coming. They saw it coming. The reaction of the international community. They've threatened with shutting down the oil provisions of from the Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, but they won't do anything to prevent anything because they know that this is a loser game for the Kurds. And it's a very bad image for the whole Kurdish region. So he is like, this is a gift from God, if he believes in that, that will prohibit any reaction from the Kurdish people inside Turkey, because it matters for him is the Kurds inside Turkey. So this referendum makes the Iraqi Kurds, the Kurds as a community, a hostile people in international community. You know what I mean? So it's good for him. So he doesn't have to fight more for that.
Right.
Yeah, but we're not talking about Iran, which I think in some ways is the most problematic.
They're against it.
Oh, they're very against it. But it's in many ways the most problematic and in many ways the most ruthless, even as ruthless as the Turks can be, regime when it comes to dealing with their own Kurds. And there's a big affinity between the Kurds in Iran and the Kurds in Iraq, much less so between the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Turkey, who are from different backgrounds, different faith. So we'll see. But I think the Iranian front is the one to look at very closely, and that gets sort of paved.
And there is oil.
And then there's the oil.
I mean, because, we're talking about this referendum, but it is important, I think, to point out that, you had the KRG area, which is firmly in Kurdish control. Then you have these so-called disputed areas, and obviously Kirkuk, right, oil-rich Kirkuk falling in to that disputed.
And that seems to be Baghdad's red line.
It is a massive bone of contention.
Yeah.
So that's throwing a giant spanner into the works, so to speak.
All right, lots mixed reactions on the hashtag world this week. Some in support of the Kurds, like this one. Where is the international outcry? Iran, Turkey, and Iraq gang up on Kurdistan region, set to impose sanctions, lock the region down. Others taking the opposite view that, Barzani has overplayed his hand. Fans hail him as a pop culture icon that contributed to the sexual liberation of Western society. Detractors denounce Hugh Hefner as a pornographer who most certainly did not advance the cause of women. The founder of Playboy magazine passed away this week at the age of 91. His publication, a mix of, nude women, pornography, but also reporting big interviews with musicians, writers, and politicians, and a brand that spawned cocktail lounges and merchandising.
One of the things that I have always felt about Playboy, whether it included the centerfolds or not, is that the magazine, it's not a sex magazine. If it had been, it would not be as continually as popular as it is today.
Not a sex magazine, Christopher Dickey.
Well, let me just say that I have published two things in Playboy.
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure. The first
Photos?
The first work.
Exposure?
Yeah, and in fact, it was no. The first was a work of fiction back in 1974, and then some war coverage in 1981. But at its heyday, in fact, there was a lot to read in Playboy, and it was good. Now, you may have said you bought it to read and you used it for other things, but I don't know why you're laughing, Francois. But in fact, there was a lot to read, and there was a lot of good stuff. They also did a Playboy interview with my father at one point. So it was something that people would go to read whatever they did before or after they read.
Donald Trump made the cover of Playboy, right? I think.
Well, I wouldn't call that a recommendation.
Way back when, yeah, right?
How will history remember Hugh Hefner?
Well, I'm not a fan of Hugh Hefner, but I've been reading, since his death, I've been reading tales of women working for him and posing naked for him. And they are distressed in the way he was treating them. And that's very tough to read. Some felt violated by the whole treatment. And some correspondents who were invited in his villa mansion, they said it's like an orgy. But a fake orgy,
and that it was like a prison as well.
It's like a prison. He arrives with 5 women around him, and the waiters used to say, "Oh, he's been living with them." So the whole atmosphere, it was in their saying, was so unhealthy that really I felt really unease. I don't think he's a major pop icon. I think he did a good job concerning the U.S. sexuality at some point, because there were so much Puritans. In the 60s, in the 70s, he helped a lot. But then the modern image of women, I don't know. I think he destroyed it.
It's interesting kind of seeing the reaction this week on social media, and it's very sort of, it's kind of binary. You have there's some group of people who just can't get past the fact that he probably was a lecherous, exploitative pornographer, and there's also there's the other side of him, which is he was a very successful businessman who started out in his late 20s. As you say, he had this sort of role in challenging attitudes to sex and nudity in America in the 60s. So he's a complex, flawed character,
I think,
probably like all of us, and I think there's I think there are sides to him.
I think to the extent that he was part of the sexual revolution, that was a very positive thing. But there's no denying that he was incredibly exploitative in terms of women, and that a lot of his talk about the sexual revolution was an excuse or a cover for blatant exploitation of women. I don't think there's any question about that.
One of the most scathing commentaries, but sort of spot on, I guess, in some respects. Julie Bindel, British journalist, feminist, basically calling him a sexist scum of the lowest order, and saying anyone who believes that he was, somehow some icon of the sexual revolution, he was actually a sadistic pimp. Those were her words, and the ultimate enemy of women, that he essentially took, porn, turned it into an industry, took pornography and took it from back street to Wall Street, commodified sex, and made it acceptable for sort of insecure men to suddenly feel like they had some cachet or whatever because they carry around Playboy, and it sort of made them feel like...
Or joined Playboy clubs. That was
Playboy
the real,
clubs, the whole idea of these gentlemen's clubs that all of a sudden emerged from the 1970s, right? All of a sudden it was acceptable. It was sanitized. We're
gonna leave it there, but I want to thank all of our panelists: Adam Plowright, Douglas Herbert, Tomais Papayannou, Christopher Dickey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
I was alluding.
And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. The discussion goes on about Hugh Hefner.
The discussion does go on. It also went on in the newsroom, I noticed. But anyway.
Very much so, yes. I mean, I was reading a lot about him yesterday, and it is interesting to see. I mean, Gloria Steinem back in 1963 went into his clubs, and she said, this is not a club, this is pornography, this is exploitation. And a lot of people still share that view. And it's interesting that one of his most famous girlfriends said absolutely nothing yesterday on social media, because she's written books talking about the fact that she was exploited, that she felt like she was a prisoner, and also detailed some of the sort of sexual activity that went on there, and there's nothing sexy about it. It actually makes you want to vomit. So there we go. Anyway, that was my little bit on Hugh Hefner.
Yeah.
Not why I was here at all.
No. You're here to talk about Puerto Rico.
I am here to talk about Puerto Rico. Yes, slight change of tack there. Yes, one of the interesting things at the moment is that there is really quite a backlash against Donald Trump and his reaction to Puerto Rico, particularly people drawing comparisons with when things happened on the mainland, whether it was Houston, Florida. There seemed to be a lot more support, whereas with Puerto Rico, he's almost been blaming the country itself, blaming the place itself.
An exclusive in the Washington Post where he said he barred lawmakers from going because he claims that would hamper relief efforts.
Well, he's going there himself on Tuesday. I'm not quite sure what sort of reception he's going to get. He did actually blame the sort of the slow arrival of aid on the fact that there's a big ocean there in the way, as it were. He maybe hasn't heard of ships. I'm not quite sure. But lots of people talking about this reaction. Matt Worker did this for Politico earlier this week. There he is angrily tweeting his responses as the people of Puerto Rico are underwater. And he's continued to be pretty angry about the way he's been viewed in response to this. He says the FEMA and first responders are doing a great job in Puerto Rico, but then he goes on to say this, that he wishes that the response from the media would be just as positive. Now, if he wants to see positive coverage, he might want to stay away from any of the coverage of the news conference that was held earlier today. The acting Homeland Security Director, Elaine Duke. Take a listen to what she had to say.
I am very satisfied. I know it's a hard storm to recover from, but the amount of progress that's been made, and I really would appreciate any support that we get. I know it is really a good news story.
Ooh, that was the wrong word.
Absolutely. But then when asked to qualify it, she didn't back down. She did try to say that their response was good and people should view it in a positive light. Unsurprisingly, people on the ground in Puerto Rico outraged by this, none more so than the mayor of San Juan. Carmen Julín Cruz said that this is not a good news story. This is a people are dying story. Now, she has been quoted a great deal online today. When you're drinking from a creek, it's not a good news story. When you don't have food for a baby, it is not a good news story. And it just does reinforce this idea that Washington is very much out of touch with what's happening in Puerto Rico.
Washington's out of touch, but Hollywood isn't.
They'd like to think they're not. Jennifer Lopez, J-Lo, Jenny from the block, as she likes to call herself,
right,
of course, has Puerto Rican heritage, was born in the Bronx. She has donated $1 million. She's also done a great deal to popularise and promote all of the fundraising efforts that are going on. There's been a lot of things like that. Beyoncé's recorded a song in Spanish, and she's going to be donating all the proceeds to victims of the hurricanes and earthquakes. This Twitter user saying, "I love my president," clearly thinks President Beyoncé is the woman that we should have. Rihanna tweeted directly to Donald Trump, "I know you've probably already seen this, but I just wanted to make sure, don't let your people die like this." And it's a front page of the New York Daily News, which is really stark reading. But lots of famous people stepping in, really wanting to do their bit. Stephen Colbert has possibly come up with the most fun way to address it. On his show, he came up with the idea of the hashtag PuberMe. It's instead of puberty, and the idea is that every famous person who tweets an image of themselves when they were an awkward teenager, i.e. in their puberty, going through puberty, his foundation would actually donate $1,000. So there is Stephen Colbert's offer, complete with braces. It was in a discussion with Nick Kroll, who's made a programme about puberty, hence the link, and that's the guy who made it. Just in case you were wondering what we look like in our teens, that's me with a lot of hair and a little shot of Francois Picard lurking in the left-hand corner.
I wasn't a teenager
there.
Yet there.
Oh, well, close enough. That's as close as I could find.
Right.
But they've raised tens of thousands already.
All right, I got to be careful what I post on the internet.
You have.
Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.
That's when you were...